By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final and most demanding phase. The United States possessed overwhelming naval, air, and industrial superiority, while Japanese strategic options were rapidly narrowing. Island campaigns conducted over the previous years had brought American forces steadily closer to the Japanese home islands. Within this context, the seizure of Okinawa was conceived as the final preparatory step for a potential invasion of Japan itself. Okinawa's significance derived from its geography and scale. Unlike earlier objectives, it was a large, populated island with terrain suitable for major airfields, anchorages, and logistical bases. Control of Okinawa would allow sustained air operations against the Japanese mainland and provide forward staging areas for amphibious forces. From a strategic perspective, the operation promised to resolve the problem of proximity by force, removing the last major barrier between Allied power and Japan's core territory. However, the conditions under which the battle unfolded differed fundamentally from earlier Pacific engagements. Japanese doctrine had evolved in response to catastrophic losses at sea and in the air. Rather than contesting landings directly, Japanese planners emphasized defense in depth, concealment, and deliberate attrition. The objective was no longer to defeat invasion outright, but to impose costs severe enough to influence American strategic decision-making. For the United States, Okinawa was approached as the culmination of established operational practice. Amphibious assault followed by systematic reduction of enemy resistance through firepower and maneuver had proven effective across the Pacific. Yet, Okinawa combined scale, terrain, and enemy intent in a way that fundamentally altered the character of combat. What followed was not a campaign of rapid advance, but a prolonged struggle defined by attrition, logistics, and endurance. The Battle of Okinawa matters because it revealed the limits of operational dominance when confronted by an enemy committed to cost imposition rather than positional defense. It demonstrates how doctrine, terrain, and strategic necessity interacted to produce the most lethal battle of the Pacific War. Understanding why Okinawa became so costly requires examining not only Japanese resistance, but the Allied assumptions and constraints that shaped how the battle was fought. The Battle of Okinawa emerged from a strategic logic shaped by necessity rather than opportunity. By early 1945, American planners were no longer selecting targets to weaken Japan incrementally. They were preparing for a decisive phase of the war that would determine its conclusion. Okinawa was identified not as an isolated objective, but as an operational prerequisite for potential invasion of the Japanese home islands. This logic was formalized in Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious operation conducted in the Pacific Theater. The operation envisioned the seizure of Okinawa as a forward base, capable of supporting sustained air operations, naval concentration, and logistical staging on a scale previously unnecessary. Unlike smaller island objectives, Okinawa was expected to function as a continental-style base rather than a temporary outpost. American strategic assessments emphasized geography above all else. Okinawa's proximity to Kyushu placed it within direct operational range of the Japanese mainland. From Okinawa, heavy bombers could operate with greater frequency and reduced logistical strain. Naval forces could anchor in protected waters, and ground units could assemble in preparation for follow-on operations. These considerations framed Okinawa as indispensable within the prevailing invasion-centric planning model. At the same time, Japanese strategic conditions had deteriorated sharply. By 1945, Japan had lost effective naval power, air superiority, and the ability to maneuver strategically. These losses forced a reassessment of defensive doctrine. Japanese planners no longer believed they could prevent American landings through decisive engagement at sea or in the air. Instead, defense was reconceptualized as a means of imposing cost. This doctrinal shift was reflected in the defensive preparations on Okinawa. Command responsibility rested with Mitsuru Ushijima, whose mission was not to repel invasion outright, but to maximize American casualties through prolonged resistance. Ushijima's orders emphasized preservation of combat power, concealment, and defense in depth rather than beachline opposition. Terrain played a decisive role in shaping this approach. Southern Okinawa consisted of ridges, escarpments, and natural cave systems well suited to fortified defense. Japanese engineers expanded these features into an integrated network of underground positions capable of surviving sustained bombardment. The intent was to absorb American firepower and force ground forces into close, attritional combat, where technological advantages were reduced. American planners were aware that Japanese resistance would be intense, but expectations remained grounded in earlier experience. Previous amphibious campaigns had demonstrated that, once landings succeeded and airfields were seized, organized resistance could be reduced systematically. Okinawa was therefore approached as an extension of a proven method, rather than as a fundamentally different problem. This assumption shaped force composition and operational sequencing. Landing forces were optimized for rapid buildup and expansion of lodgements. Fire support plans emphasized overwhelming preparatory bombardment, followed by inland advance. The possibility that Japanese forces would largely forego beach defense and concentrate their strength inland was acknowledged, but not fully integrated into operational expectations. The scale of forces committed reflected the perceived importance of the objective. More than 500,000 Allied personnel would ultimately be involved in Operation Iceberg, including U.S. Army and Marine Corps units, naval forces, and air components. This concentration of power reflected confidence that decisive force application would shorten the campaign and reduce overall cost. However, the strategic logic contained an implicit assumption that cost would remain manageable relative to gain. Okinawa was expected to be difficult, but necessary. The idea that it could become the most lethal battle of the Pacific was not central to planning. Casualty estimates existed, but they were framed within acceptable thresholds derived from previous campaigns. Japanese planning, by contrast, explicitly sought to exceed those thresholds. The defense of Okinawa was designed as a demonstration of what an invasion of the home islands might entail. By prolonging combat and inflicting sustained losses, Japanese leadership hoped to influence American political and strategic calculations, even if the island itself was ultimately lost. This asymmetry of intent is critical. For the United States, Okinawa was a means to enable future operations. For Japan, it was an opportunity to reshape the cost-benefit analysis of the war's final phase. These competing logics ensured that the battle would not conform to earlier patterns. Thus, before the first landing craft approached the beaches, the conditions for extreme attrition were already established. Okinawa combined scale, terrain, doctrinal evolution, and strategic desperation in a way unmatched elsewhere in the Pacific. The battle that followed was not an accident of brutality, but the predictable outcome of opposing strategies focused on endurance versus inevitability. Understanding this context is essential. Okinawa did not become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific because of a single decision or failure. It became so because both sides entered the fight with objectives that made prolonged, costly combat unavoidable. The opening landings would soon confirm that Okinawa was not another island to be taken, but a battlefield designed to extract maximum cost from victory itself. The opening landings on Okinawa appeared at first to confirm American operational expectations. When Allied forces came ashore in early April of 1945, resistance along the beaches was minimal. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment had suppressed visible defenses, landing schedules were maintained, and units advanced inland with comparatively low casualties. To many commanders, the absence of immediate opposition suggested that Japanese resistance had been disrupted or delayed. This interpretation, however, reflected a misunderstanding of Japanese intent rather than an accurate assessment of battlefield conditions. Japanese defensive doctrine on Okinawa deliberately avoided decisive engagement at the point of landing. Unlike earlier island battles, where beach defenses and counterattacks sought to repel invasion outright, Okinawa was organized around a strategy of interior resistance. Under the command of Mitsuru Ushijima, Japanese forces allowed American units to land unopposed in order to preserve combat power and channel the enemy into prepared killing zones further south. The beaches were not the battlefield. The interior was. This approach reflected lessons learned from catastrophic losses in previous campaigns. Japanese command recognized that direct confrontation with American naval and air firepower was unsustainable. Survival required concealment, dispersion, and exploitation of terrain. Okinawa's southern sector offered precisely these conditions. Ridges, reverse slopes, stone tombs, and natural cave systems provided cover from bombardment and enabled a layered defense that could not be neutralized through firepower alone. American doctrine, however, remained oriented toward rapid expansion of the lodgment and seizure of operational objectives. The initial phase focused on securing airfields and road networks to enable follow-on operations. Early success reinforced the perception that Okinawa would conform to established patterns: land, expand, isolate resistance, and reduce it systematically. The possibility that the main battle had not yet begun was acknowledged, but not operationally dominant. As U.S. forces advanced southward, this assumption began to erode. Contact with Japanese defenders increased sharply once units encountered the first major defensive belt. Fire came not from obvious positions, but from concealed emplacements integrated into the terrain. Engagements occurred at close range, often without clear visibility of the enemy. Japanese units emerged briefly to fire, then withdrew into underground positions immune to immediate retaliation. This shift marked a fundamental change in the character of combat. American forces were no longer advancing against a collapsing defense, but entering a deliberately constructed attritional system. Progress slowed dramatically as units were forced to identify, isolate, and neutralize individual positions one by one. Each engagement required coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor, yet terrain constraints limited the effectiveness of supporting arms. Japanese resistance was not uniform or continuous, but episodic and controlled. Defenders avoided unnecessary exposure, conserving strength for moments when American movement made units vulnerable. This selective engagement maximized psychological and physical strain on attacking forces. The absence of a clear front line further complicated command and control, creating uncertainty about enemy strength and disposition. The American response relied on established methods: increased firepower, methodical advance, and local adaptation. Artillery concentrations were expanded, and air support intensified. However, the effectiveness of these measures was reduced by the nature of the defenses. Bombardment could suppress, but rarely destroy, deeply embedded positions. Once fires lifted, resistance often reemerged. The battle became iterative rather than progressive. Environmental factors compounded these challenges. Okinawa's spring rains transformed terrain into mud, restricting movement and degrading logistics. The density of forces operating in confined areas increased vulnerability to artillery and mortar fire. Casualties accumulated steadily, not through single catastrophic engagements, but through continuous attrition across weeks of fighting. At the operational level, American command faced a growing dilemma. The battle was unfolding as Japanese planners had intended, yet disengagement was not an option. Okinawa's strategic importance remained intact, and the scale of forces committed made withdrawal inconceivable. The logic of completion prevailed, even as costs exceeded early expectations. Japanese forces exploited this commitment. Their strategy did not depend on holding ground indefinitely, but on prolonging resistance and inflicting casualties. Even as losses mounted and logistical conditions deteriorated, the defensive system continued to function. Each day of resistance validated the Japanese objective of cost imposition, regardless of the island's eventual fate. This phase of the battle revealed the limits of American operational dominance when confronted by an enemy optimized for endurance rather than maneuver. Superior firepower and mobility could not compel rapid collapse. Instead, they were absorbed into a contest defined by time, terrain, and willingness to accept loss. By the end of this period, it was clear that Okinawa would not be resolved quickly. The battle had transitioned from an amphibious operation into a prolonged ground campaign, whose tempo and cost were dictated by the defender. The bloodiest phase of the Pacific War was not the result of initial assault, but of what followed. Once both sides settled into a struggle, neither could easily escape. Part 2 thus establishes a critical analytical point. Okinawa became extraordinarily costly not because American forces failed to land successfully, but because success in landing triggered entry into a defensive system designed explicitly to neutralize American strengths. The decisions made by Japanese command before the first landing craft arrived ensured that the real battle would begin only after the beaches were secured. As the Battle of Okinawa moved into its central phase, the character of the fighting became increasingly defined by attrition rather than maneuver. The initial American advance, which had proceeded rapidly across the northern and central portions of the island, slowed almost to a halt in the south. There, Japanese defenses were concentrated in depth, integrated with terrain, and designed to resist reduction through prolonged combat. This phase explains why casualties escalated so dramatically, and why Okinawa became a battle of endurance rather than operational movement. The core of Japanese resistance was anchored along a series of defensive lines in southern Okinawa, most notably the Shuri Line. This system consisted of interlocking positions built into ridges, reverse slopes, and underground complexes that dominated all approaches. The defenses were not linear in the traditional sense. Instead, they functioned as overlapping zones of fire, allowing Japanese units to withdraw from one position while continuing to contest the same ground from another angle. Japanese command deliberately avoided counterattacks designed to retake lost ground. Earlier campaigns had demonstrated that such actions resulted in rapid destruction under American firepower. On Okinawa, the objective was to deny the attacker a decisive engagement. Resistance was calibrated, localized, and persistent. Positions were held only as long as they could inflict casualties, then abandoned in favor of secondary defenses. This approach forced American forces into repeated assaults without the opportunity for rapid exploitation. For American ground units, this defensive design imposed severe operational friction. Movement forward required clearing each position individually, often under direct observation and fire. The absence of a clear breakthrough point meant that progress was measured in incremental advances rather than operational gains. Units remained in contact continuously, with little opportunity for rest or reorganization. American doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, but Okinawa's terrain constrained its effectiveness. Armor was restricted by mud, narrow roads, and anti-tank obstacles. Artillery provided continuous support, yet its effects were limited against deeply entrenched positions. Air support, while extensive, faced challenges of proximity, weather, and target identification. As a result, infantry bore the primary burden of reducing defenses, often in close combat under constant fire. Casualties mounted steadily during this phase. Unlike earlier battles where losses occurred during discrete assaults, Okinawa imposed continuous attrition. Mortar fire, artillery, snipers, and concealed machine gun positions inflicted losses day after day. Medical evacuation was complicated by terrain and weather, increasing the physical and psychological toll on units engaged for extended periods. Environmental conditions intensified these effects. Spring rains transformed southern Okinawa into a landscape of mud and flooded positions. Trenches collapsed, vehicles became immobilized, and supply routes deteriorated. These conditions reduced mobility and increased exposure, amplifying the effectiveness of Japanese defensive fires. The environment became an active contributor to attrition rather than a neutral backdrop. At the command level, American leadership recognized that the battle had entered a protracted phase. but options were limited. Okinawa's strategic value precluded disengagement, and the scale of commitment made operational pause difficult. Reinforcements were rotated into the line, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Japanese defenses could not be bypassed without leaving active resistance in the rear. Japanese forces, though suffering heavy losses, maintained cohesion through disciplined command and control. Defensive positions were supplied through underground routes, and units were rotated within the cave system to sustain resistance. Even as manpower declined, the defensive network continued to function. The effectiveness of this system lay not in preserving combat power indefinitely, but in extending resistance long enough to impose unacceptable cost. This dynamic altered the psychological dimension of the battle. For American forces, the absence of decisive progress undermined morale and increased fatigue. Success was defined narrowly as survival and incremental advance, rather than achievement of operational objectives. For Japanese defenders, the battle validated their strategic purpose. Each day of continued resistance, regardless of territorial loss, represented success within their doctrinal framework. The escalation of casualties during this phase was not the result of tactical incompetence, but of structural conditions imposed by opposing strategies. American forces were committed to securing Okinawa as a prerequisite for future operations. Japanese forces were committed to making that security as costly as possible. These objectives were incompatible with rapid resolution. By this point, Okinawa had surpassed earlier Pacific battles in scale and intensity. The number of troops engaged, the duration of continuous combat, and the density of defensive fires created conditions unmatched elsewhere in the theater. The battle was no longer defined by amphibious assault or rapid advance, but by sustained ground combat, resembling continental warfare more than island fighting. This phase demonstrates why Okinawa cannot be understood solely through the lens of landing operations or individual engagements. The bloodiest aspect of the battle emerged after initial success, when both sides were locked into strategies that prioritized endurance over maneuver. American superiority ensured eventual victory, but it did not shorten the fight. Japanese resistance ensured defeat, but it maximized cost. By the end of this period, the outcome of the battle was not in doubt, but its cost trajectory was clear. Okinawa had become a battle where time itself was a weapon. Each additional day of combat increased casualties without altering strategic inevitability. This reality defined the bloodiest phase of the Pacific War and set the conditions for decisions that would follow. Part 3 thus establishes a central conclusion. Okinawa became extraordinarily lethal not because of a single failed decision, but because the battle evolved into a sustained attritional contest shaped by terrain, doctrine, and strategic necessity. Once this dynamic took hold, neither side possessed a practical mechanism to disengage from it. As the Battle of Okinawa progressed into late spring of 1945, the interaction between attrition, command decision-making, and strategic necessity intensified. This phase marked the point at which the battle's extreme lethality became systemic rather than episodic. Casualties were no longer tied to specific assaults alone, but to the cumulative effects of sustained exposure, limited maneuver options, and an operational environment designed to exhaust the attacker. American command increasingly understood that Japanese resistance in southern Okinawa would not collapse through shock or breakthrough. The defensive system anchored around the Shuri line functioned as an attritional mechanism rather than a positional barrier. Each withdrawal by Japanese forces was deliberate, conducted only after a position had fulfilled its purpose of inflicting casualties and consuming time. The battlefield geometry ensured that American forces, regardless of tactical success, would remain under constant pressure. This reality forced a shift in American operational behavior. Rather than seeking decisive maneuver, commanders emphasized systematic reduction through firepower and incremental advance. Artillery fire plans became continuous rather than preparatory. Naval gunfire was employed not only in support of assaults, but as a standing element of pressure against suspected positions. Air power remained extensive, yet its role increasingly shifted from decisive strike to sustained suppression. Despite this concentration of force, results remained limited. Japanese positions embedded in reverse slopes and underground complexes absorbed punishment without collapsing. Destruction of individual strongpoints rarely translated into broader operational advantage. The reduction of one position often exposed another, equally prepared, further inland. The battle thus became recursive. Success generated the conditions for renewed resistance rather than resolution. The human cost of this pattern was severe. Infantry units operated in near-continuous contact, with limited opportunity for rest or rotation. Casualties accumulated through small unit engagements, artillery fire, and snipers, rather than massed attacks. The psychological strain of constant exposure to lethal but often unseen threats contributed to fatigue and reduced combat effectiveness over time. Environmental conditions continued to magnify attrition. Prolonged rainfall turned defensive positions and supply routes into mud, restricting movement and increasing vulnerability. Medical evacuation became more difficult, extending the time wounded personnel remained under fire. These factors did not change the strategic situation, but they increased the marginal cost of each operational action. Japanese command exploited these conditions by maintaining discipline and fire control. Engagements were initiated selectively, often at close range, to maximize effect. Withdrawal routes within the underground network allowed defenders to avoid destruction and reappear elsewhere. Even as Japanese losses mounted, the defensive system retained coherence long enough to fulfill its strategic purpose. At the operational level, American leadership faced an absence of alternatives. Okinawa's role as a future base for operations against the Japanese mainland remained central to planning. Disengagement was not considered viable, and bypass was impossible given the island's size and location. The only available course of action was continuation, regardless of cost trajectory. This phase underscores a critical analytical point. The bloodiness of Okinawa was not a function of escalation alone, but of persistence under conditions where escalation could not produce proportional returns. Additional firepower reduced resistance locally, but did not shorten the battle in aggregate. The relationship between effort and effect became increasingly asymmetric. By this stage, Okinawa had exceeded previous Pacific battles not only in casualty figures, but in duration of sustained high-intensity ground combat. The battle resembled a continental attritional campaign compressed into a confined space. American material superiority ensured progress, but Japanese defensive intent ensured that progress remained slow and costly. The interaction between these factors produced a form of operational lock-in. American forces could not disengage without abandoning strategic objectives. Japanese forces could not win, but could continue to impose cost. The result was a battle whose lethality increased precisely because its outcome was already determined. Part 4 therefore explains why Okinawa's casualty figures continued to rise, even after its strategic outcome became inevitable. The bloodiest phase of the battle was not driven by uncertainty, but by the absence of exit options for either side. Once attrition became the dominant mechanism of interaction, time itself became the primary weapon. This phase set the conditions for the final stages of the campaign. Japanese resistance would eventually collapse under cumulative pressure, but not before demonstrating the full cost of invasion under modern conditions. Okinawa thus functioned not only as a battle, but as a preview of what a larger invasion of the Japanese home islands might entail. The later phase of the Battle of Okinawa was defined by escalation beyond the ground battlefield. As American forces pressed southward and Japanese defenses contracted, the struggle expanded into a multi-domain contest in which naval operations, air attack, and logistics became inseparable from ground attrition. This expansion intensified casualties and reinforced Okinawa's status as the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Japanese leadership understood that ground resistance alone could not reverse the strategic situation. By late spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been largely destroyed as an effective fighting force, and conventional air operations were unsustainable. Within these constraints, Japanese planners pursued a strategy of asymmetric escalation, aimed at inflicting cost where American superiority was most exposed, at sea and in the airspace over the invasion area. This strategy manifested most clearly in massed suicide air attacks against Allied naval forces supporting the Okinawa operation. These attacks were not improvised acts of desperation, but an institutionalized component of Japanese operational planning. Aircraft were employed as guided weapons against ships, prioritizing carriers, transports, and support vessels whose loss or damage could disrupt the invasion's sustainment. The objective was not tactical victory, but cumulative attrition. For American forces, this introduced a second, parallel battlefield. Naval units operating off Okinawa faced continuous air threat over an extended period. Unlike earlier campaigns, where air attacks were episodic, Okinawa subjected the fleet to sustained pressure day after day. Ships remained on station to provide fire support, air cover, and logistics, increasing exposure and fatigue among crews. Casualties at sea rose accordingly. Damage control became a constant activity rather than an emergency response. Even when ships were not sunk, damage reduced operational availability and strained repair capacity. Personnel losses among naval crews added to the overall casualty count of the campaign, expanding the human cost beyond ground forces alone. This naval attrition had direct implications for ground operations. Fire support schedules, resupply, and medical evacuation all depended on vulnerable maritime systems. Disruption at sea reverberated ashore, complicating sustainment and increasing the burden on units already engaged in intense ground combat. The interdependence of domains meant that attrition in one area amplified pressure in others. Japanese escalation extended beyond air attacks. In early April of 1945, Japanese leadership authorized Operation Tengo, a one-way naval sortie intended to attack Allied forces off Okinawa. The operation's intent was symbolic as well as operational, to demonstrate continued resistance and impose cost even at the expense of total force loss. The destruction of the task force underscored Japan's strategic isolation, but also reflected the willingness to expend remaining assets to influence the battle's cost profile. On land, Japanese resistance persisted despite collapsing logistics and mounting losses. Defensive positions were abandoned only when rendered untenable, and surviving forces withdrew into increasingly confined areas. The reduction of resistance did not follow a linear trajectory. Periods of apparent progress were often followed by renewed contact as defenders re-emerged from concealed positions. This pattern extended the duration of close combat and maintained casualty rates even as Japanese combat power declined. American command responded by sustaining pressure across all domains. Artillery and air support remained intensive, and ground units continued methodical advance despite exhaustion and loss. Reinforcements rotated into the line, but the scale of the battle limited relief. Okinawa demanded continuous engagement from a large portion of available forces, increasing cumulative exposure. The psychological impact of this phase was profound. For ground troops, the knowledge that resistance would continue regardless of progress undermined expectations of closure. For naval crews, the persistent threat of suicide attack imposed constant stress. The battle environment normalized high casualty risk, contributing to fatigue and reduced margins for error. From an operational perspective, the escalation reinforced the logic of attrition. Japanese action sought to demonstrate that any approach to Japan's core territory would incur unacceptable cost. American persistence, in turn, reflected the strategic necessity of securing Okinawa, regardless of losses. These opposing imperatives ensured that escalation did not shorten the battle, but intensified it. The cumulative effect was a convergence of attrition mechanisms. Ground combat imposed steady losses. Naval operations incurred sudden, often catastrophic casualties. Air defense absorbed continuous strain. Logistics and medical systems operated at sustained capacity. No single element determined the battle's bloodiness. It emerged from their interaction over time. By this stage, Okinawa had surpassed previous Pacific battles not only in casualty figures, but in the breadth of forces affected. The battle encompassed infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, carrier aviation, logistics personnel, and medical services. Losses were distributed across the entire operational system, reinforcing the perception of Okinawa as a total battle rather than a discrete engagement. This phase also sharpened strategic awareness at higher levels of command. The scale of losses incurred in securing Okinawa informed assessments of what a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands might entail. The battle functioned as empirical evidence of the cost imposed by a defender committed to attrition and sacrifice. Okinawa thus influenced not only immediate operations, but strategic decision-making beyond the battlefield. Part 5 clarifies why Okinawa's casualty figures continued to rise even as Japanese defeat became inevitable. Escalation across domains transformed the battle into a sustained test of endurance. Japanese strategy succeeded in imposing cost, while American strategy succeeded in sustaining pressure. The bloodiness of the battle was the product of this interaction, not of isolated decisions or failures. By the end of this phase, Okinawa had become more than a battle for territory. It was a demonstration of modern warfare under conditions of strategic desperation and operational dominance. The consequences of this demonstration would extend beyond Okinawa itself, shaping how the war's final decisions were evaluated. As the Battle of Okinawa moved toward its conclusion in early summer of 1945, the cumulative effects of attrition forced strategic reflection beyond the immediate battlefield. This phase examines how Okinawa's extraordinary cost reshaped American assessments of feasibility, endurance, and acceptable loss, and why the battle came to function as a practical benchmark for decisions regarding the war's final phase, rather than merely as another campaign objective. By this stage, Japanese ground resistance was collapsing unevenly. Organized defenses in southern Okinawa were increasingly fragmented, with remaining units isolated in pockets lacking supply, coordination, or realistic prospects of survival. Yet the reduction of resistance did not produce a corresponding decline in casualties. Small unit engagements, cave clearances, and final defensive stands continued to inflict losses on advancing American forces. The relationship between remaining enemy strength and inflicted cost remained asymmetrical to the end. American command understood that victory on Okinawa was assured, but the manner of that victory raised fundamental questions. Casualty reports reflected losses on a scale not previously encountered in the Pacific. These losses were incurred not during a single decisive moment, but through sustained exposure over weeks of combat. Okinawa demonstrated that even when strategic dominance was overwhelming, an enemy committed to attrition could still impose severe cost through terrain, doctrine, and time. The implications of this realization extended beyond operational planning. Okinawa was not simply a large island battle. It was a proxy for what a direct assault on the Japanese home islands might entail. The scale of forces engaged, the density of defenses, and the willingness of Japanese forces to accept annihilation in place were all conditions expected to be magnified in any invasion of Japan itself. Okinawa thus served as an empirical case rather than a theoretical model. This perception influenced strategic deliberations at the highest levels of American leadership. While Okinawa was still being fought, parallel planning for a potential invasion of Japan continued. The casualty experience on Okinawa informed estimates, assumptions, and risk assessments associated with those plans. The battle provided concrete evidence that attritional resistance could persist even in the absence of strategic hope, raising doubts about the sustainability of a conventional invasion approach. Naval and air losses further reinforced this assessment. The sustained suicide air campaign against Allied shipping demonstrated that Japanese capacity for cost imposition extended beyond ground combat. Even without air superiority or a functioning fleet, Japan could still threaten critical systems supporting invasion. Okinawa revealed that control of sea and airspace did not equate to immunity from loss, particularly when operations required prolonged exposure near hostile territory. For American forces, this phase of the battle was characterized by endurance rather than maneuver. Operational decisions prioritized maintaining pressure and completing the mission rather than achieving decisive tactical outcomes. The objective had narrowed to elimination of remaining resistance, regardless of diminishing strategic marginal returns. This focus reflected institutional commitment to completion once an operation had begun, even when its broader implications were shifting. Japanese command, for its part, remained consistent in intent even as collapse approached. The objective of imposing cost had largely been achieved. The defenders could not alter the outcome, but they could shape its price. The final stages of resistance were less about tactical effectiveness than about prolongation. Each additional day of combat reinforced the message that invasion would be costly beyond earlier American experience. The psychological dimension of this phase was significant. For American planners and political leaders, Okinawa transformed abstract estimates into tangible reality. Casualty figures were no longer projections. They were daily reports. The human cost of progress was visible and cumulative. Okinawa thus narrowed the gap between operational analysis and strategic consequence. At the same time, the battle underscored the limits of adaptation at the tactical level. American forces continued to refine techniques for cave reduction, coordination, and combined arms employment. These adaptations improved efficiency locally, but they could not fundamentally alter the attritional nature of the engagement. Okinawa demonstrated that tactical excellence could mitigate loss, but not eliminate it, when the enemy's strategy was designed to trade space for time and lives for delay. By the final weeks of fighting, Okinawa had become a symbol within American military analysis. It represented the upper bound of expected resistance under modern conditions. The battle's duration, casualty density, and breadth of engagement across land, sea, and air provided a comprehensive picture of what sustained invasion warfare might look like against a determined defender. This realization did not negate Okinawa's strategic value. The island was secured, and its facilities would support subsequent operations. However, the cost at which this success was achieved altered how future operations were evaluated. Okinawa was no longer just a stepping stone. It was a warning indicator embedded within success. The battle's conclusion, therefore, carried significance disproportionate to its geographic scope. Okinawa did not merely close one campaign, it reframed the calculus of the war's end. The bloodiness of the battle was not an accidental excess, but a predictable outcome of strategies that prioritized endurance over maneuver and inevitability over retreat. Part 6 establishes why Okinawa became decisive beyond its immediate tactical outcome. It forced recognition that victory against Japan's core territory would not resemble earlier island campaigns. The battle revealed the full cost potential of invasion under conditions of strategic desperation and doctrinal adaptation. In doing so, it shaped how American leaders understood the remaining options available to end the war. Okinawa thus stands as more than the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. It functioned as a proving ground for assumptions about endurance, cost, and resolve. The lessons derived were not abstract or hypothetical. They were measured in sustained casualties incurred after victory had already become inevitable. The final phase of the battle would confirm this understanding, leaving Okinawa as a reference point against which the war's ultimate decisions would be judged. The final phase of the Battle of Okinawa must be understood not only in terms of battlefield resolution, but in how the experience of the campaign was absorbed into American strategic thinking. By the time organized Japanese resistance collapsed in late summer of 1945, Okinawa had already begun to influence decisions far removed from the island itself. This phase examines how the battle reframed assumptions about invasion, endurance, and the limits of conventional victory. As fighting tapered off, American forces transitioned from combat operations to consolidation and base development. Airfields were expanded, anchorages secured, and logistical infrastructure established at a scale consistent with Okinawa's original strategic purpose. In this narrow sense, the operation achieved its objectives. Okinawa became a forward base capable of supporting sustained operations against the Japanese mainland. Yet, the cost at which this capability was obtained reshaped how it was evaluated. American planners could now assess invasion scenarios with empirical data rather than projections. Okinawa had provided a full-scale test of Japanese defensive doctrine under conditions of extreme material imbalance. Despite the absence of naval and air superiority, Japanese forces had imposed casualties through terrain exploitation, concealment, and refusal to seek decisive engagement. This outcome challenged earlier assumptions that overwhelming force would compress timelines and reduce losses as operations moved closer to Japan. These observations fed directly into planning for a potential invasion of the home islands, commonly grouped under Operation Downfall. Okinawa functioned as a comparative baseline. If a peripheral island with limited resources and no prospect of relief could generate such losses, the implications for an invasion of Japan itself were severe. The scale of resistance expected on the mainland, where terrain, population density, and logistical depth were far greater, suggested a level of attrition potentially beyond political and societal tolerance. The experience of Okinawa also influenced assessments of Japanese resolve. The battle demonstrated that Japanese command structures could maintain cohesion and discipline even under catastrophic conditions. Defensive operations continued long after strategic defeat was assured. This persistence was not an anomaly, but a reflection of institutionalized doctrine, emphasizing sacrifice and delay over survival. Okinawa confirmed that this doctrine was operationally effective at imposing cost, even when strategically futile. At the same time, Okinawa revealed limits within American operational practice. Tactical adaptation occurred continuously, but it did not change the fundamental nature of the fight. Firepower could suppress and reduce resistance, but not compel rapid collapse. Maneuver was constrained by terrain and defensive design. Attrition became the dominant mechanism of progress. This pattern raised questions about the scalability of existing doctrine when applied to even more demanding conditions. The naval dimension reinforced these concerns. Okinawa subjected the U.S. fleet to sustained attack over a prolonged period, producing losses unprecedented in earlier Pacific operations. These losses occurred despite overwhelming American air power and radar coverage. The implication was clear. Proximity to Japan increased exposure exponentially. Any operation requiring prolonged naval presence near the home islands would incur continuous risk, regardless of dominance at sea. From a strategic perspective, Okinawa narrowed the range of acceptable options. The battle did not negate the feasibility of invasion, but it clarified its cost profile. What had previously been framed as difficult but manageable now appeared potentially catastrophic. Okinawa did not provide certainty, but it reduced ambiguity in a direction unfavorable to large-scale amphibious assault. This recalibration did not occur in isolation. It interacted with intelligence assessments, diplomatic considerations, and emerging capabilities. However, Okinawa provided the most concrete evidence available. Casualty figures, operational timelines, and logistical strain were no longer hypothetical. They were documented outcomes of a campaign fought to completion. For American leadership, the implications were cumulative rather than decisive. Okinawa did not dictate a single course of action, but it reshaped the context in which choices were evaluated. The battle demonstrated that victory through invasion was possible, but at a cost that would likely exceed earlier expectations by a significant margin. This realization increased the weight assigned to alternatives that might shorten the war without replicating Okinawa's attritional dynamics on a larger scale. Importantly, Okinawa also highlighted the limits of learning within the battle itself. Adaptation improved efficiency at the margins, but it did not change the underlying exchange ratio. This suggested that further refinement of tactics would not fundamentally alter outcomes in similar future operations. The problem was structural rather than procedural. By this stage, Okinawa had acquired meaning beyond its immediate military value. It became a reference point in strategic discussion, a data set against which projections were tested. The bloodiness of the battle was no longer merely a historical fact, but an analytical input shaping decisions about the war's end. The final clearing operations on the island, while militarily necessary, reinforced this perception. Resistance persisted until it was physically eliminated. There was no negotiated collapse, no decisive turning point that suddenly reduced casualties. The battle ended through exhaustion and destruction rather than maneuver or persuasion. This reinforced the conclusion that similar outcomes could be expected elsewhere under comparable conditions. Part 7 therefore situates Okinawa as a bridge between battlefield experience and strategic decision-making. The battle's importance lies not only in what happened on the island, but in how those events were interpreted and applied. Okinawa transformed abstract estimates into lived reality, narrowing strategic imagination while sharpening risk awareness. By the time Okinawa was secured, its lessons were already influencing the final phase of the war. The battle had demonstrated the full cost potential of modern attritional defense against overwhelming force. It did not end the war, but it reshaped how ending the war was understood. The Battle of Okinawa concludes as a definitive case study in how strategic necessity, operational doctrine, and enemy adaptation can converge to produce extreme attrition even in the presence of overwhelming material superiority. Its final significance lies not in territorial gain, but in how the battle reframed assumptions about the limits of conventional military power at the end of the Pacific War. Okinawa did not become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific because American forces lacked capability or resolve. It became so because the operation combined several reinforcing conditions that eliminated the possibility of rapid decision. The island's size and terrain prevented bypass. Japanese doctrine rejected decisive engagement in favor of endurance. American strategic planning required completion rather than containment. Once these elements aligned, attrition became the only available mechanism of progress. From an operational perspective, the battle demonstrated that superiority does not equal efficiency. American forces controlled the sea and the air, possessed unmatched firepower, and maintained logistical dominance throughout the campaign. Yet these advantages could not compel collapse when the defender's objective was to survive long enough to impose cost. Firepower reduced resistance incrementally, but it did not shorten the battle proportionally. Each tactical success generated further contact rather than resolution. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was not strategically effective in the traditional sense. It did not alter the outcome of the war, preserve territory, or restore initiative. Its effectiveness lay elsewhere. By transforming defeat into a prolonged process of cost imposition, Japanese command succeeded in shaping the conditions under which victory was achieved. Okinawa demonstrated that even a defeated power could influence the form and price of its defeat. For the United States, this realization carried implications that extended far beyond the island. Okinawa provided the most comprehensive empirical evidence of what an invasion of Japan might entail under conditions of total resistance. The battle showed that attritional defense could be sustained without air or naval superiority, without hope of reinforcement, and without prospect of victory. It therefore challenged the assumption that greater force concentration would necessarily shorten future campaigns. Institutionally, Okinawa exposed the limits of doctrinal inheritance. Amphibious and combined arms doctrine had evolved successfully through earlier campaigns, but Okinawa revealed a boundary condition beyond which those methods could not deliver rapid results. The problem was not tactical execution, but strategic geometry. When the objective could not be bypassed and the defender could not be dislodged quickly, doctrine offered no alternative to persistence. The battle also illustrated how momentum constrains choice. Once Okinawa was designated as essential, disengagement became politically and institutionally impossible. Even as costs escalated and strategic assumptions evolved, the operation continued because its completion was embedded within broader planning for the war's end. Okinawa thus demonstrates how large-scale wars can sustain costly actions, not because they remain optimal, but because they are already in motion. In retrospect, Okinawa occupies a dual position. It was both a success and a warning. The island was secured, and its facilities contributed to Allied operational capability. At the same time, the battle revealed that success achieved through attrition carries consequences that extend beyond immediate objectives. Okinawa did not simply precede the war's end. It shaped how that end was conceptualized. Analytically, the battle resists reduction to moral judgment or hindsight condemnation. The decisions that led to Okinawa were rational within their original context. What Okinawa demonstrates is not error, but lag, the delay between changing strategic reality and institutional adaptation. That delay was paid for in time, casualties, and endurance. The bloodiness of Okinawa was therefore not accidental. It was the predictable outcome of opposing strategies that left no room for compromise or disengagement. American strategy required the island. Japanese strategy required suffering to be imposed. Terrain enabled both. Once engaged, neither side possessed a mechanism to shorten the contest without abandoning its core objective. In final assessment, Okinawa stands as the most lethal battle of the Pacific, not because it was uniquely brutal, but because it was uniquely clarifying. It revealed the full cost potential of modern warfare when maneuver gives way to attrition, and when victory is inevitable, but not immediate. The battle transformed abstract estimates into demonstrated reality. Okinawa did not end the war. What it did was define the outer boundary of what conventional victory against Japan would likely cost. In that sense, its importance lies not only in what was achieved on the island, but in how its lessons constrained and informed the final strategic decisions of the Second World War. The Battle of Okinawa remains a case where success was undeniable, necessity was real, and cost was unprecedented. Its legacy is not a question of whether it should have been fought, but of what it revealed about the price of fighting to the end under modern conditions.